Welcome to the US Eagle Claw YouTube channel. The heavy defeats of the Russian army on the Ukrainian front are beginning to disturb Putin's cabinet and his most trusted allies. As a result of the defeats of the Russian army, the atmosphere is getting tense as Kadyrov, Prigozhin, and the Kremlin focus on different views. Putin's adopted son, Kadyrov, is more worried about the Ukrainian war than the Russian leader. As the tension in the Ukraine-Russia war reached its peak, the Russian army's withdrawal from the occupied Ukrainian territory one by one seems to have made Vladimir Putin very nervous. Russian troops, suppressed by the Ukrainian armed forces, are slowly fleeing towards the country's borders. The defeat of the Russian army, which the Moscow administration describes as a precautious withdrawal, is on the agenda of the Russian media almost every day. In Russia, while the picture of the war was so bad, Vladimir Putin's declaration of mobilization throughout the country intensified the situation. But Putin had no other choice. The Russian army, which lost almost in every Ukrainian region it took a step in, suffered heavy losses, and it does not seem possible to compensate for these losses. If we look at the situation of the Russian army, in the last 2 months of the war, many of its top generals were lost in Kherson, Kharkiv, and most of the southern fronts. Russian troops had to leave their weapons on the battlefield and flee. Currently, there are many Russian soldiers in the Russian army who still have weapons dating from the old Soviet era. It is reported that even the Russian soldiers who were mobilized and sent to the region suffered from equipment shortages. The Russian army, which has been devastated by the operations carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces at midnight, does not even want to fight in Ukraine anymore, because it does not seem possible at the moment for the Russians, whose shipping routes have been cut off, to send reinforcements to the Ukrainian front. In addition, Russia does not have enough professional soldiers. Kadyrov, who has given the greatest support to Putin to date, began to brood over to save him. It is stated that Kadyrov has presented a method that will get Putin out of the bottleneck. Kadyrov plans to provide 2.5 million well-trained Russian soldiers to the Ukrainian front, even if it will get a big reaction from the Russian people. Let's examine the details of this crazy offer of Kadyrov together. The Russian people and opposition groups in the Russian parliament became quite angry with Vladimir Putin after the mobilization decision. Every night, the Russian people continue their protests in the streets with anti-mobilization banners in their hands. These protests did not cease, even though the Kremlin assured that there would be no new mobilization order, because Russian families don't want to watch their men perish on the Ukrainian front. Russian parliament members, on the other hand, claim that Vladimir Putin is responsible for the Ukraine-Russia war and argue that he should be held accountable before the public. In the face of these allegations, Russian President Vladimir Putin had nearly 1,800 of his own citizens who participated in the mobilization and anti-war protests taken into custody with the help of the Russian police. In response to the opposition group in the Russian parliament, Putin stated that making negative criticism about Russia during the war would harm the army and that this is treason. Even if these two moves silence some sections of the public and parliament, a certain majority still continues to oppose Putin. When we evaluate the event from different angles, Russian leader Vladimir Putin is actually the person who is most uneasy, although he may seem comfortable in this process. Someone who is as concerned about the Ukraine-Russia war as Putin is the Russian leader's right-hand man in Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov. Kadyrov, who has not fallen off the agenda with his statement, is perhaps more worried than Putin about the situation of Russia and the Russian army. There are actually many other reasons behind these statements of Kadyrov, who shows the degree of his loyalty to the Russian leader with his words, "I say you command what Putin says. I am Putin's soldier." Kadyrov, who was elected the third president of Chechnya for the third time, received billions of rubles under the name of state subsidies and additional plane budgets from the Russian administration, even directly from the Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Since it is Putin who keeps Ramzan Kadyrov in power, Kadyrov looks up to him. Stating that he was always with Russia and under the command of Russian leader Putin in the Ukraine-Russia war, Kadyrov has so far sent 2,000 soldiers to the battlefield to fight in Ukraine. Chechnya's Putin, Kadyrov, has now made another statement that will move the agenda. The leader of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, called for sending a large number of security guards to the war in Ukraine, including employees of the FSB, FSO, the Federal Penitentiary Services, and the Ministry of Emergencies. According to his estimates, 2.5 million security guards could be sent to war from different parts of the Russian Federation. The number of soldiers Kadyrov intends to send to Ukraine is a very serious figure. This striking statement by Kadyrov is still among the most talked about topics on the agenda. In addition to this offer he made to Putin, Kadyrov continues to threaten Ukraine. The Ukrainian intelligence service put the president of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, on the wanted list. The Chechen leader, on the other hand, threatened to punish Ukraine, which added him to the wanted list. Kadyrov told Kiev that there was no need to put his name on the arrest warrant because he would come alone. In the video he shared on his Telegram account, Kadyrov said, "Dear SBU members, determine the place. I will come myself. I will come for you, and I will punish you for all the crimes you have committed." The Chechen leader added, "There is no need to look for me much. By the way, I've even been to Ukraine twice, and I didn't see them thinking about catching me." Noting that the Ukrainian intelligence service did not take any real action to locate him, Kadyrov said, "Because their electricity is constantly cut off, working in these conditions is very difficult. In addition, the constant air raid sirens are also obstructing it." These threats by Kadyrov do not intimidate the Ukrainians. However, Kadyrov draws the attention of his fighters in Ukraine with his crazy attitude. Chechen fighters fighting in the ranks of Ukraine say that they cannot accept Kadyrov's servitude to Putin, and that they will start a new freedom movement in Chechnya with the end of the war in Ukraine. Considering that the star of the Chechens and the Russians is not at peace, if the Russian army loses in Ukraine and becomes weaker, the probability of such a rebellion breaking out in Chechnya seems very high, because the Chechens, who lost thousands of their citizens and soldiers in the First and Second Russian-Chechen Wars, express at every opportunity that they have not forgotten what the Russians did to them. In other words, the war that Russian President Vladimir Putin will lose in Ukraine will cause him to suffer losses not only in Eastern Europe, but also in the Russian Federation. A different claim also rose from Western sources. The war that started with Russian invasion of Ukraine was endless, despite the efforts of the mediators, and the US media made a remarkable claim. One of the leading US media outlets wrote that the Russian intelligence unit FSB is preparing for a possible tension in Moscow. An unnamed source told the media outlet that tensions have risen between Russian President Vladimir Putin and his allies Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the mercenary group Wagner, and Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov. Saying that the tide has turned in Moscow recently, the official said, "Chaos, civil war, and collapse. All of this is ahead of us and it is inevitable." Reaching the correspondents within the FSB, the news organization reported that there were disagreements within the Kremlin, and that Prigozhin and Kadyrov were seen as a political threat to Putin. However, the source, who did not reveal his name, commented, "There is no simple model for leaving power in Russia. While there may be an uprising at first and only chaos and looting may occur, but the security forces may be in trouble against Prigozhin's group. Such a war would be bad, but generally avoidable." On the other hand, in another scenario, it was stated that the soldiers and security forces in some regions in Russia confronted for resources. In this scenario, many Russians now think that the point of no return has been reached. They want to be the petty tsars of the regions they have captured. Prigozhin and Kadyrov know their time has come and they must separate themselves. Both know that Putin no longer needs them once they consider stopping fighting and start a dialogue. In the correspondence shared by the official, who also stated that Russian intelligence units expect provocation from Prigozhin and Kadyrov, it was said, "If everything goes according to Prigozhin's plan, we may lose both control and the country." Putin's new fronts seem to be beginning to form, and these threats do not come from outside Russia's territory. The stabs inflicted on Putin's back by his two most trusted men could knock Vladimir Putin down completely.